All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. And as promised, and I waited a few minutes before we got things started. As promised, I wanted to do an overview of the story so far about the Legends of Trodair. And it is the final book in the Blood Witch grouping. We have the original, The Blood Witch, and then we have the three history books, which take place over 1,000 years at 200-year intervals before the actual Blood Witch. And then this one takes place about 3,000 years later. Some of you have seen the timeline story that I actually produced. That one was covered there. In that, I can't remember when I did it. It was a couple of weeks ago where I actually went over some of the timeline. So if you're interested in that, I had a cheap graph. It wasn't quite complete. It wasn't quite accurate, but gave you an idea of where all the different stories took place over the history of their world. And with the Legends of the Trodair, this is going to be a very big book. And this, what we're doing today, or what I'm going to go through today, is it's an overview so far. I'm probably going to have to do a few of these because I had mentioned it before in some of the chats that you don't have the book in your hands. And without that, and without having you to go back and listen to all the videos that I've done previously, I'll do periodic overviews so you can get caught up to some degree. So I'm going to go over the major characters. The lead two are Heather and Lake. They are the Troder, descendants of the Trodair family, hence the Legends of the Trodair. And Lake, we know at the very beginning of the story, he had performed too much magic. They were stealing a device, and why they were stealing it, we're going to get into it a little bit more later on. Hey, how you guys doing? With him, it seems like he's a background story, but remember, this book is going to be quite large, and I think you're going to really like him when his story starts taking off. But at the beginning, he had done his limit of magic, and he's fighting the mage sleep. So that's where we're at. How you doing, Snarty? So he's going to wake up soon. When he does, you'll find his plot line. There's actually somewhere around 5 major plot lines. This is a very complicated book, and that's why I'm doing these reviews. Heather is his twin sister, and they are both, like I said, they're in their later 20s. They're both wealthy, aristocratic type. But when their parents died early, there was a lot of things that they didn't learn about business, about relationships, about different things that go on in their world. And if you guys pay attention on Sunday, you're going to start to see a little bit of the problems that Heather has. But they are both very highly trained from the people that we call the High Guard. Those of you who followed the story know what the High Guard is. They started, that was 600 years before the Blood Witch, with the Blood Witch history, Ulgonsah. Those first High Guard, they numbered 54 elite warriors. And over the years, when it was Veronica's time, there was about 100 of them. And there's always very few because it's quite demanding, not just physically, but they also have to be extremely morally sound and very dedicated and very trustworthy. And they have some heavy processes to weed these people out. Well, in the time of Heather and Lake, there are only 5. So we're going to start with the oldest and work our way to the youngest. The oldest of the 5, and you met some of his personality last Sunday. It would be the video immediately before this one. His name's Tyson. These guys get paid a lot from the Troder family. And so they really don't need to work, but they do so as kind of a facade. Think of them as a kind of a hidden secret warrior, very almost religious, kind of like what the Templars were when they began, but quite skilled. Well, Tyson's the oldest; he's in his 60s. I haven't talked about his family yet, but he does a lot of metalwork as his cover occupation. But in the process, they have in their society, like we talked about last week, they work on apprenticeships. So he uses that to help find, train, and weed out who could be and who may not be any replacements or future high guard. The next oldest is Frank. Yeah, we'll go with Frank. Frank and Jason are kind of a similar age. Frank, you met early on. We haven't done a lot of talk about him. He's on a mission for the Schroeder and for the High Guard. You met his wife, Anna, and his son, whose name is Torin. And they're at a place called Mountain Fall, which is, it comes up in the books, especially the Ulgonsah, which it's huge in Ulgonsah, very tragic there. It comes up in the Blood Witch. There is some tragedy there as well. It's kind of a haunted place, full of wealth, but it's not utilized because of where the wealth came from. If you want to find out, you'll have to go to History Ulgonsah and see how that was manufactured. But either way, it's a repository of various different things. And Frank's there, and they gathered pretty much what they needed, and his part of the plan will come out a little later. Then we have Jason. Jason, I described him as being early on as their best warrior when it comes to physical demands. He would be their weapons expert, their James Bond type. He's the master of the trade, so to speak, and he was the one who did most of the training for Heather and Lake, but he and Lake really took off, especially since their dad died. So that's Jason. And then we have Tolo. Tolo's an interesting guy. Some of you have heard of, in the earlier books, it was the island of the Kelly, and over the years, things changed. This is now the Keldonan. Tolo is one of them. They are a very spiritual people. And he is not only a high guard, but he also works as kind of think of it as a inside man in the Navy for it's a Republic of Ag, and he's a captain. His story is going to come out a little bit more this week on Sunday. You hear a little bit more about him, but Sunday's mostly a chapter about Heather, but he is also in there. So some of these things will overlap. He is quite a powerful man, very tall, very strong, very disciplined. And then we come to Benny. He's the newest of the High Guard. He is every bit worthy of the High Guard, but he is also a little bit silly at times. Quite the thinker. His father also, mother took off, dad passed away. He was left in the hands of the Troder family when he was young, and raised by them and by the High Guard. So he always kind of idolized, hey Chris, his dad, who was a scientist and a engineer, and so Benny's been trying to mimic that. So those are the major players. Where the story is now, we know that Heather is missing 2 friends, and she set about trying to discover what's going on with him. Lake is in the mage sleep. He used his magic too often, too quick, and when he wakes up, that's really going to be fun. And the High Guard are doing a lot of the day-to-day business for the Troder when it comes to the black cast industry, and recruiting, running the day-to-day things. So the major plot lines you really don't see yet, except one of them, which is Heather and her missing friend. And then Tolo, where he's there. When we first introduced him, he's with his admiral that he served under, and they were worried about war between the Veracruz nation and the Gelbecks. And So he's on a mission to help try and secure certain resources so that AG will be able to play their part in this. More of that story. That's one of the major plot lines. It's really going to it's going to be fun going through that. So that's where we are. That is the big part of the first section for Legends of the Trodaire. I do want to cover, and I'll probably clip this sometime in the future, but I want to go through some of the history and lay down just so you can get an idea of who's who over the history. First off, let's talk about the mages. The mages show up every 200 years. It's not like the blood witches where it's before. It used to be whenever they were born without red hair, because their family genetic code is very, very powerful. And they're always born with red hair, except the rare occasion where it's a blood witch. And now in the Heather and Lake's time, if there's twins, then they also have magic. So this is very, very rare. That's where they are now. Hey, May, how you doing? But so let's go over the mages in history. The very first one that we talk about, this is before we get with the dragons and when we learn about Vahanoi. So we're going to leave him out of it because he really doesn't rank with these guys. But if we're talking the most powerful of the mages that are in the books, Jana is by far ahead of all of them. She was the death wind that nearly extinguished all life on the planet until she was isolated and hunted on basically well springs. But age pretty much took her down. There was a story about that in the Ulgonsah where she was eventually killed, but it wasn't necessarily because of those who went and got her. It was because she was just hundreds of years old, and she did everything that she could with her magic to stay alive. Then there is Dre. Dre is a guy that we don't know a lot about, but he would probably be number 2 when it comes to the ones in the books that is the most powerful mage. He is also a Deathwind. He is the one in the Blood Witch that Veronica and Torin have to battle, and he's very nasty. Then strictly because of age, because the mages in my books, they get stronger with age. The older they get, their powers become less taxing on them and more easily cast and with greater effect. So in the Ulgonsah, it would be Othin, and Othin's kind of schizophrenic. So his magic is very twisted. That's half of the reason why blood witches exist. It's partly because of his magic. So next one, and this is the only one this is where we start doing without the Deathwinds, because Deathwinds are the real bad guys. The next one, hey Salty, and thanks everybody for being here. If you wanted to know what this is about, we already passed the overview section. This is just me filling in gaps of different things. But you take aside the Deathwinds with the magic power, they are far and beyond the most dreadful and capable because they feed off of magic, unlike the other mage users where it taxes them. The mage sleep comes easier, where a Deathwind can almost fight through it. But the next one would be from the Blood Witch, actually, Torin. He is extremely impressive, and I don't get into it too much, but just know that if there's a legend to be had, it's about him. He's the only one that was able to enchant items. He never wrote it down how he did it, why he did it. It just that he had done some items, and we now know from having Frank going to Wellsprings to Mountainfall that several of them were destroyed. So there's very few left of his artifacts. After that would be my favorite character that I've ever written at all. Hannah Ulgonsah. She is the only healer mage, extremely powerful, but her magic is all based on helping others because in her heart, her life exists to help others, not to help herself. She puts other people above herself easily even above her own family, because of some tragedy that she had as a child where people were picking on her and doing various different things. She learned to, instead of hating people for it, she learned to reach out. And then there's another one from her time, which is Plato. He was another nature caller. He was old and powerful. Some of the stories about him, the very end, the prologue or the epilogue for the Ulgonsah is Plato. And then in Ellie, we have Pratt and his wife Kelda. Now, Kelda technically did turn into a death wind, but she was taken out too early. So her full power never really came into fruition. So the ones that I've talked about, those are the big ones, except for Vahanoi, which he's a dragon. So, that was a miscast, mistake by him, and that's how he turned out. So now we're going to list, again, I may cut this out later on, but these are the blood witches through history from the books. The most powerful, and the only reason why I do this is because of something very specific. Because I could talk about Gifford, who was the very first one, and he was also the first High Guard. He highly trained combatant, super powerful guy. When just physicality, but when he discovered the blood witch ability, he was the one who figured it out. Just nuts. But the problem with all of them is that a bloodlust sets in with the blood witches. It's like a feeding frenzy almost for a vampire. The power overtakes them, and it's an addiction that lasts as long as they can burn through the living blood that they have in their mouth. So he was next. Then there's his father and his uncle, Vin and Kai. Of course, Vin was his dad. He died. Almost all the Ulgonsahs get wiped out. So you could read the story about it. Kai became the king, and he was the one who decided that this power needed to be hid, and that's why it was gone for so long, hidden until Andros kind of rediscovered it. But the High Guard has always kept it, the secret to it, and watched over the Trodair and the Troder in case they ever needed it. And then the next one would be Timothy. That was a cousin of Gifford. He was another warrior, but not as trained as Gifford. And then there was Ellie, which was the last book. And you guys will know about Ellie. She hated it, hated everything about it, because she did not like the feeling of enjoying killing people and using that bloodlust. But the story is about fighting addiction, her and Kelda, the different extremes of whether you give in or whether you resist. And then there's Andros, and he's one of the bigger books that I've written, but he never used it, never even knew about it until he was very old. But the most powerful by far was Veronica in the Blood Witch. She had the unique ability to resist the bloodlust. She could be very, very focused. She could be mad with anger and very violent, just like all of them. They're bloody stories, but she maintained control. So there you have it. But for those of you who listened so far, and those of you who are here, thanks for being here. If you wanted to get the update of where and why this video exists, is for the Legends of the Trodair. And I'll probably do, like I said, this is a big book. Probably when I get it all laid out and everything, it might be significantly larger than the Blood Witch. We might do 4 or possibly 5 more of these, because again, there's several different plot lines. All of them are important. This is a very convoluted story, and I don't want anyone to get too far out of the loop without having one of these updates. And so there you have it. Next video actually will be Sunday, and we're going to be back with Heather, and you'll start to see more of her personality and the difficulties that she has because she lost her mother and father. Lake has similar problems, but his are different and they manifest different. The story is not going to go the way you think it is. So hold on your hats. It's going to be quite fun. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining me, and have a good night.